So I'm going to be talking about battery storage. I'm going to be talking about technology and about how storage fits into the grid a little bit. This isn't comprehensive because you could spend a long time talking about just storage. But what I want to say is I'm going to run through a bunch of technologies. I think there are going to be some winners and some losers, and I think we have some ideas of who they might be at this stage. But I actually don't care how you store energy as long as you do store energy. If you're going to store it in a rubber band, that's okay by me, as long as it's cost effective and reliable, and it fits in with the parameters that we need for the grid. So I'm technology neutral on this. Just got to work. I'm the founder of a website called energyshouldbe.org. We have about 14 videos, and we're about to cross 100,000 views on our various videos, which is pretty good given that the topic is energy. And I think this might be my 5th presentation over the years for CRES, and I was engaged in CRES and in Amendment 37 back in 2004. So about 2 weeks ago, I presented for Boulder's CRES an hour-long talk. How many people were there? Yeah, okay, goodly number of you. I've got groupies, this is great. And that talk went over how we're going to get to 100% renewables, why the transition is occurring, and a variety of other topics, including talking about one of the biggest barriers that I see to clean energy is open markets and competition, that's something we don't have in Colorado and that we need. Martin, bless his soul, has videoed that, and it's up on the CRES YouTube channel. You can find it just by searching for my name, Ken Regelson, in YouTube, and that's the first video that'll come up. So if you want to know more about those topics, go ahead. But I did like about 2 minutes on storage, and Martin came up to me and he said, Ken, we're going to do a talk on storage, and we want somebody to talk about technology. And I said, okay. So that's what you're going to see. So I actually have a couple questions before I get to this one. How many people have say maybe a quarter or a third of their roof or more is sunny? How many people have solar panels on that sunny roof? Yeah, this is CRES. I'd expect to see an awful lot of people like that. Yeah, that's a terrific thing. How many people either own a plug-in vehicle or at least have test-driven one? Okay, the reason I bring these topics up is that this is the future that I see. Solar on people's roofs, where they have sunny roofs, and electric vehicles. Plug-in, I don't care if it's a Volt or, where it's plug-in plus a gasoline engine or if it's all electric. All works for me. What we need is for people to take action. And as Martin was talking about, it's actually been a while since we've seen a lot of positive action from the federal level. In fact, the action that's happening around the country is happening locally and state. But the thing that's nice about solar and about electric vehicles and now about storage is that you can do it yourself. You don't need anybody's permission to do this. Well, storage, maybe you do. We'll talk about that in a little while as far as that goes. So now, this question that's up here. So what I'm curious is, how many people think that they know or guess where storage becomes essential when we start moving up in the amount of renewables? So don't put up your hands yet. What I'm going to ask you to do is put up your hands when I say the number that you think we need to start seeing storage at in order to keep the lights on in a renewable energy grid. So 60, 70, 80, 90, 98%. So when you hear the number that you think storage needs to be happening, you're going to put up your hand. 60%. 70%, 80%, 90%, and 98%. And so what that means, of course, is that people correctly figured out that with energy storage, we're going to need it before we hit 90 or 98%. But it may be surprising to people that we can actually model this. And in fact, this is a spreadsheet model in Microsoft Excel that we put together about, now almost, 7 years ago, the very first version of this. This is about the 3rd or 4th version. And you can download this for free from my website, energyshouldbe.org, and /models. And you can actually enter in, oh, wait, I have a laser beam here somewhere. Except this projector is so bright that you can't see the laser beam. Okay, you can actually enter in the amount of battery, the amount of wind and solar. This is based on actual Colorado data. The load data, how much electricity we're using, is from the city of Boulder, and the wind and solar are based on Colorado numbers. So it's actual data, and you can play around with them. You can adjust the number of meters and make an estimate for your town or the entire state of Colorado, what have you, and figure out how much battery you actually need and where it kicks in. And here's the basic answers. 60%, we actually don't need storage. Okay? You can keep the lights on with a reasonable mix of wind and solar and backup. At 70%, you need 350 megawatts. What's interesting to note is the storage goes up 350, 700, 1200, 2400. For every 10% that you go up, you almost have to double the amount of storage until you get to very high numbers as you get to 98%. And it shows the amount of solar and wind. Again, this is for the city of Boulder, but it's easy enough to adapt for other places. That's if you just did storage to keep the lights on. Because the key problem that we want storage, I think everybody knows this, but sometimes I wonder about the utilities. You know, the sun, this is for anybody that's from the utility industry, the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. You have to do something else for that. That was a joke, okay, because really, okay, thank you. There's lots of things that we can do to keep the lights on. And I'm not going to go into these in detail because that hour-long talk, I did go into these in detail, but I'm going to read them really fast. You can build more than you need. The concept here is, look, wind is so cheap now that the wind doesn't blow 100% all the time. There's a lot of the time it's blowing halfway. If you built twice as much wind as you actually needed when the wind was blowing all the way, then it would be working 100% for you when it was blowing halfway, right? So you build more than you need. You mix solar and wind. They work really well together. Storage, well, that's what we're going to be talking about. I think everybody gets the idea. Electricity storage can help us fill in the valleys when the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining. We want to encourage electricity use when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. By lowering the price, that's how we encourage things, and by setting things up automatically. So, for example, I would like my electric vehicle charger to be able to say, hey, the wind's blowing, the cost is low, time to charge up the batteries. Or the sun is shining, the cost is low. And in fact, there are electric chargers that can do that, can talk to the internet and find that out. We're going to use some amount of existing fossil generators for some time to come. You know, transitions don't happen overnight. And maybe for a long period of time, that last 5%, it takes a lot of extra renewables and battery to do that. Maybe we just say 5% fossil is okay. And of course, we want to use electricity and all of our energy just as efficiently as we can. What mix are we going to use? I don't know. That hasn't been invented yet. We need innovation for that. Now, there is a lot of different storage technology. In fact, I could probably talk for a couple hours on the different technologies I've been reading about over time, and I'm not going to do that because it would be boring and because it would repeat itself a lot, because it really turns out there are just a few categories. But before I get into that, let's talk about how we need to use this in storage for the electrical system. It's basically how much time, the duration that we need the storage to work. So we might need just a few seconds of electricity storage, okay? If the wind suddenly drops for a little bit and we have a lot of electricity being used, we might just need to fill in a couple of minutes or hours or days or weeks. I don't think it's ever going to be years. I don't think there's ever a time where within at least a week or so, the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. So that's what we need to fill in with storage. That's what we're looking at. And whenever we talk about the technology, we've got to think about how long is it that we need. And some of that's cost, and some of that's the technology itself. This isn't precise, but I filled in the percentages of renewables as to where they fit in. 70%, you know, it's minutes that we need it for. 80%, maybe it's into hours. 90%, maybe it's a day. And 98% is where we start talking about days or maybe even weeks to get that last 2% with that. Now, I actually think one of the winners is going to be battery storage. And it has to do with the money. And it has to do with mass production. And the mass production that's happening for that is mostly around electric vehicles. This is the Gigafactory. Everybody's heard of the Gigafactory, right? This is Tesla Motors. Has anybody not heard about the Gigafactory? Okay, or you're afraid to raise your hands, either way. The Gigafactory, I don't think anybody, I certainly don't have the idea of just how big this building is going to be. It is 1/3 finished, the building itself. They are making batteries and battery packs and shipping them now, right now. That's going on, okay? It's in Reno, Nevada, okay? When it's complete, it will be, depending on who you want to talk about, exactly the metric you're using, it's going to be the largest manufacturing building in the world. Okay, one building, as far as that goes. When it's finished, it's going to have a solar roof starting pretty soon, but when it's done, it will have a 70 megawatt solar roof. Now, I can remember when we got excited, this isn't very long ago, this was 2004, 10, 11, 12 years ago. Well, we got excited when there was a 0.5 megawatt installation, and we're talking about a single building with a 70 megawatt installation on the roof. Unflipping believable. And they believe that the solar by itself will power the building and the manufacturing that goes on inside of it, plus they're going to use their own storage batteries to cover night and times when the sun is blocked, when it's cloudy or what have you on that. The bright yellow, that's what's completed. The kind of less bright yellow, that's what will be completed this year. And the red, that's the final build-out of the factory itself. Mass production works for driving the price down. In fact, we're seeing the price of batteries fall about like that. It's not quite that fast, but it's almost that fast. Let me give you an example. And when I present data, I try to present something that I can justify really clearly. And whenever possible, I like it when there's a contract involved, a deal between somebody that wants electricity, like an electric utility, and a company. Because then I know competition was at work and it's straightforward and clear. The island of Kauai Electric contracted in 2015 and in 2016 for solar plus 5 hours of battery storage to go with that. These are not small solar systems, not as big as the Gigafactory, but they're roughly 20 megawatts of solar each with 5 hours of battery storage. 5 hours, when you're looking at electric grids, there's a peak. The peak tends to be 5 hours long. That's why you want to meet 5 hours of resolution from a generator. This is competing directly with natural gas generators from utilities. In the case of Kauai, it's actually diesel generators, but the same general idea, burning something to make electricity. In 2015, the solar plus a battery contract was 14.5 cents, and 1 year later, it was 11 cents, and there's no reason to believe that the price isn't going to drop again. And yeah, solar was part of that price drop, but most of the price drop was from battery costs coming down. Unflipping believable change in batteries. Pardon? That's per kilowatt hour. To put that in perspective, we pay an average of about 13 cents per kilowatt hour in Colorado. In Hawaii, their average is on the order of 20 cents a kilowatt hour. They have to bring diesel in small quantities, and that's very expensive to do, not to mention very polluting. Kauai Electric is moving very aggressively to 100% renewables, and they figured out, gosh, we need some battery storage to make that work, to make that effective. I'll give you another example. I don't have a slide for it, but y'all might remember that in California, there was a natural gas storage, underground storage area called Aliso Canyon that sprung a leak, okay? Not a little tiny leak, but a great big giant leak. It's no longer being used until they figure out if they can prevent that kind of leak from ever happening again. As a result, Southern California was short on natural gas. In fact, they had a little cold wave here, not cold from our perspective, but cold for Southern California. And they didn't have enough gas to go around because Aliso Canyon was down. And so natural gas generators, mostly in California, peak electricity use is not the winter, it's the summer. And there wasn't enough natural gas in the pipelines to be able to supply Southern California's electricity needs in the summer. And California's Public Utilities Commission said, oh my God, we've got a problem. We can't just put natural gas generators to fix this because there's no natural gas, so what are we going to do? And they said, you know, that storage stuff has gotten pretty cost competitive. Can it get in there and do the job? And they said, well, let's find out. And in fact, they previously to this had bid, previous to Aliso Canyon, they actually bid natural gas peakers against battery peakers, and the battery peakers had won on cost. And so they said, we know the cost is effective. Can they do it in time? Because we need this by the summer. And so this is absolutely true, is basically they went from problem statement, we've got a problem, to in the ground connected battery systems in under a year, in less time than you can site a natural gas plant. Okay, it's up and running. This is cool. Cost effective. Yeah, I know. Yay! You all can do a round of applause. That would be good for that one. Actually, let's do a round of applause for Martin, because he's been shooting these videos for, I don't know, 2 years now. And just so great as far as that goes. Okay, this is a mess. Let's straighten this out. Let's go into some columns here. Break this into some kind of order. When do you want me to be done by, Martin? Don't care.
It's not important. We have ample time.
Okay, ample time. When you guys start getting bored, then make sure you let me know. You know, put your heads down, go to sleep, what have you. No, I won't take that long. Chemical cell batteries, I think everybody's got the idea. You've got a cell that's of specific size. All the chemistry is inside the cell. It might be small, it might be big, you know, it might be very big as far as that goes. Lithium is the common one right now. Sodium, magnesium, those are on the way. Various people developing them for various different reasons. Lithium is not super duper common as an element out there, although there's plenty of it. Price is going up a little bit right now, but other mines of it will be developed very quickly. Sodium, of course, there's an infinite amount of sodium from our purposes. Molten metal is kind of cool. Okay. I'm working on my humor here. Also, so you know, is I'm working on speaking Republican. So if any of you are good at giving Republican lessons or arch-conservative speaking lessons, I'd like to know that. At any rate, molten metal is you take different kinds of metals and you melt them, and if they're different densities, they stack up. And so you can actually use them as the anode, the cathode, and then your solvent in between. It's really very cool technology. It's also very hot. But they're talking about them in like swimming pool sized, if they can make the technology work. But basically, it's nothing different than any of these other batteries, different temperature, different chemistry, as far as that goes. Pardon? I'm sorry, I can't hear. Shotgun?
What happens if you shoot them with a shotgun?
The hot ones? My guess is that it melts in and, you know, kind of disappears. I don't know. You know, safety is an issue on all of these, and including lithium ion. I don't know of any Galaxy Note 7s that have ever caught fire because of their batteries. So all of these have issues. Okay, chemical flow batteries. So these are different. They're still just chemistry, but they're different in the sense of it isn't a cell where everything happens. It's spread out. What you have is 2 tanks usually, but not always. Sometimes you have 4 tanks, sometimes you have 1 tank. And you pump through a converter in the middle. The stuff that's in the tanks is cheap as you can get it, depending on what's actually in the tanks themselves, but it's a liquid. And when you pump one way, it makes electricity, and when you pump it the other way, it absorbs electricity. It's a battery. It's called a flow battery. There are 3 common chemistries that we see. Vanadium is the one that's been around the longest. Vanadium is a fascinating material. It's actually relatively expensive. And so people went and they said, can we find something that behaves chemically like vanadium, but that is cheaper? And somebody said, well, you know, iron has multiple ionic states, or stable in multiple ionic states. That's a clue as to what vanadium does. So why not that? And somebody else said, you know, there's this funny material. It's called a quinone. It's found in rhubarb, and it's an organic molecule, very easy to make, very plentiful as far as what's out there, and very cheap. So we're actually seeing rhubarb batteries that are out there. Not exactly rhubarb, but you get the idea. Not Republican, because it's vegetables, right? Actually, I know some Republicans that like rhubarb pie. Okay, and then there are others, and I didn't know how to characterize these, except in some ways they go round and round. Flywheels, okay, you know, you got the idea, it goes round and round, and you can extract electricity and you can put it back in again. Those aren't really good for hours of storage. They're meant more in the seconds of duration. And then superconductors, you've got electrons going round and round in something that has zero resistance, and you can actually store a great deal of energy in a very small space, except that you have to be very, very cold in order to keep that working, and nobody's really quite figured out how to do this in any kind of commercial way yet. That doesn't mean it won't eventually come. Again, I don't care about the technology, which technology, as long as it's cheap and durable. Gravity. I love this gravity light. Has anybody seen the video on the gravity light? No? Okay, one person has. What it is a little unit about like that. It's got a big sack of sand connected to kind of a little cable. And the sack of, it's up here. You start down here and you lift up the sack of sand and you let it go, and kind of has a little bit of clockwork that runs a little generator with an LED attached to it, and 20 minutes or so you've got light, and when you're done, you lift up the weight again. If you are like something like 2 billion people on this planet that are either without light at night or that have kerosene as their light. Kerosene's terrible. I mean, it's very expensive. It's terrible for your lungs if you're in a house. They get knocked over, burn down houses. You have people with terrible burns on their bodies or get killed by kerosene lights all over the place. This is so much better as far as that goes. That's one level. We're talking about electricity for a grid. Pumped hydro, I'll talk about that in a second. Train storage. The idea is gravity. Think of a slope with train tracks on it, and train cars that are like subway cars. Each of them has the motor in it, okay, and a little electric paddle set up on the side, okay, and you fill them full of rocks. They're heavy, okay. When you have excess electricity, you move it uphill, and when you need electricity, you let it slide downhill. Being built, one of these is being built in California right now. Very nice technology. You need to increase the size of your battery, you add a train car. Okay? Very clever, very clever. Is it cost effective? I don't know. The first one's never cost effective. Pumped hydro. I think everybody has the general idea of this, but basically, when you have excess electricity, you pump it up from one reservoir to another, one that's higher and one that's lower. And when you need electricity, you let it flow back down again and generate electricity. There are lots of these around. Colorado has several. There are not very many good places to put more of these. But there are some places. I'll take another minute here to tell another story that fits in with this, a pumped hydro in an odd, slightly unexpected place. But generally the cost of pumped hydro is going up because there are fewer and fewer places to put pumped hydro that aren't already developed. Whereas the price of batteries are crashing down, and you can figure out what's going to happen as far as the price is concerned. But there are circumstances that might make a lot of sense. It turns out in Australia there are 2 giant pit mines that were being mined for gold for like 80 years, and the gold's gone. But the holes aren't, and it turns out the holes are at different altitude. And they have water, because they were using water for extracting the gold, and they have electricity because they were using electricity, so they have a big connection to the grid, and there's even a town there to house the workers that are going to build this pumped hydro. Now, they aren't building it yet. They have a $2 million pilot project to see if the strata will work, if the idea will work and pan out, and if there are any particular issues. But it's a case where all of these factors came together where that might in fact be the cheapest choice with that. Moving right along, let's talk about compression. If we take a tank and we compress air in, we can take and let that air out again. This is the hot air solution. This should be good for Congress. And let the air out again, we can run a turbine and generate electricity. We want to do this probably on a pretty big scale, but what we have here is a situation, if we're going to use a tank, then we have high pressure. The more pressure we put in, the more energy we can store, but the stronger we have to make our tank, because the bigger the differential between the inside pressure and the outside world, the stronger the tank has to be. So you have to keep making your tank stronger and stronger. We're pretty good at making cost-effective tanks, but still, it's kind of a funny thing. So can we find other places? And it turns out there are mines. In fact, there's a mine in, I think it's Alabama, if I remember correctly, where, in fact, there is what's called a compressed air energy storage place. It's been storing, I don't know, 20 megawatt hours or something like that of electricity for like 40 years. And basically, it was a big mine, big underground mine, and they said, well, we're done mining. They capped it. They pump air in. They let it out again. You make electricity. Pretty cool. But back to this picture for a moment, because there's some clever ideas out there. Because, you know, it's one of these things. We weren't really looking for energy storage, and so nobody was looking for energy storage. So now that we are, there are lots of people coming up with really fantastic ideas. What we'd really like is to be able to have a weak tank that had enormous pressure in it. And the only way that will work is in a place where the outside pressure outside of the tank is also enormous. Okay? Anybody have any idea? I heard it. Ocean floor? Yeah. In fact, there are companies that are working on this. You take and stick a tank way down deep, run a hose pipe up to the top where your compressor generator is. You've got enormous pressure on the outside of the tank. You can put enormous pressure on the inside of the tank, and you just let the tank fill up with water. When you're discharged and charge it, you just fill it up with air at very high pressure. And the tank itself, it has to be structural but not super duper structural.
And they're flexible bladders.
There's multiple types of tanks. So one tank is a flexible bladder, another they're talking about concrete tanks. The ones that tend to be very deep tend not to be flexible bladders, because now you're talking about, well, they could be either way, in fact. Yes. Yes, so then heat. We can make a big tank and we can melt salt, okay, when we have excess electricity. And then we just, like we would with any other kind of heat, you know, what are we doing when we burn something? Well, we're making heat. Generally, we use it to boil water for burning coal, for example. We can use the heat out of molten salt to boil water to turn a turbine to make electricity. That's pretty easy. But we don't have to be that high tech or that big. We can do this in our home hot water heaters. In fact, my home hot water heater is just like this one. It's an 80-gallon tank. It's an electric tank. There's an electric element in the top of it, and the bottom is heated with solar panels, hot water panels. And this works very nicely. In fact, we use very little electricity. Of course, being the geek that I am, I have it monitored. I know how much electricity I use. Most we've ever used is 30 kilowatt hours for a month. That's not very much in terms of backup heat in the middle of the winter. Keeps us with hot showers, that kind of thing. It works because hot water stratifies. So hot up at the top where the electric element is all the time, so we have our hot showers, and the rest of the tank heats up with the solar hot water. So most of the time, we've got 80 gallons of hot water. Get to take long hot showers, it's great. No guilt associated with it. But there's nothing that stops us from taking that solar heat down at the bottom and making it a second element at the bottom, electric element, that's run off of cheap electricity heat. When the sun is shining and the wind is blowing and we have excess electricity. And you just set it up so it's got a controller that talks to the internet and says, is it a good time to buy energy? Oh, okay, it is. Let's charge up right now. And then we have this enormous multiplier. I always have hot water, and I get it cheap most of the time. I like that. The next column is fuel. Make a tank, fill it with fuel somehow. Maybe it's biomass, okay? All kinds of different technologies for this. One option is to make hydrogen and put that into a tank. and somebody asked me to bring up hydrogen. Honestly, I don't think it's going to be hydrogen, and I'll explain why in just a second. But in terms of the energy piece of it, yeah, sure, it works. You make hydrogen when you have electricity out of water and store it, and then you burn it in a regular turbine when you need electricity. That works conceptually. The problem with it is that hydrogen is not dense. In fact, a long time ago, I did a calculation on this to figure out if we were going to go and fuel our cars with hydrogen, what would it take? And so I said, well, gaseous hydrogen, no, it makes no sense at all. Not one lick of sense to use hydrogen, not because of the fuel, but because of the transport of it. You can't transport enough of it to make it worthwhile, even counting the fact that it's more efficient to burn hydrogen in a fuel cell than other places. In fact, what I figured out was that even if we were using liquid hydrogen, okay, the most dense form of hydrogen that we can easily create, which isn't actually easy, that one tank of gasoline would take 5 tankers of hydrogen. It was delivery was the problem. So, pardon?
Liquid hydrogen?
Liquid hydrogen. Yep. Yeah, I should say liquid there, not gaseous, you're right, as far as that goes. So, I don't know. Maybe somebody will solve this problem or figure it out, or maybe we'll put pipelines to every place where we have a gas station right now, but I don't think so. And maybe it's not that big a problem. I actually think that the concept's right, but that storing hydrogen isn't the right answer. That what we want to do is store a liquid fuel. Maybe it's ammonia or ethanol, something like that. The basic structure of this is pretty straightforward. You take electricity and water and a carbon source. Maybe it's sewage, maybe it's trash or compost in the converter. That's the new technology. That makes a liquid fuel. Maybe it's ethanol, maybe it's butanol, maybe it's pick up some other fluid. Put it into a big tank, and then when we need electricity, we stick it into basically the same turbines we use with natural gas with a different injector. And that makes electricity, or we can use it for long-distance transport or for building heat. That's the basic concept. And then I said, wait, you remember, I'm about not only can you do the technology, but is it sensible? And so the question is, can you build a tank big enough to do this? And so I said, okay, we know a lot about the city of Boulder, so let's look at the city of Boulder. Can we build an ethanol tank that is big enough to give us 2 weeks of electricity of all the different kinds of energy that we use, okay? Transportation, heat, and electricity, all 3, 2 weeks. And the answer was, not only did the city have one tank that size already, they actually had 6 of them. Each of our water tanks is big enough by itself to provide 2 weeks of storage. And I submit to you that if we can build a water tank, oh yeah, there's some issues with ethanol, we got to be a little more careful. We can probably build a tank that big for ethanol as well. So it passes the sniff test. Is that the one that's going to be? I don't know. I don't care. You probably got that by now, as long as it's cheap and reliable. And then there are the ones that span this. Now, liquefied air, that's really cool. I mean, that's like really cool. In fact, it's minus 212 degrees C. That's how cold it is. This is spanning the distance between compression and heat, because you have to manage both to do this. But the basic philosophy is you take, when you want to charge, what you do is you liquefy air. You compress it and chill it, okay? Stick it into a big tank, and when you need electricity, you let it expand again and run a turbine. And they said, boy, that's pretty cool, and we think we can make this cost effective. And they said, but you know what would make it really cost effective? Because when we expand it, it's so cold that it's pretty dense air. And what we'd like is to not have dense air. We want to add heat to it. And they said, well, we could add heat to it by burning natural gas, but that seems like a bad idea. And they said, is there any place we can find a heat source that's likely to be around for a long time that we could use for free because it's waste heat? And they said, scratched their heads for a long time, and they said, you know what? There are abandoned landfills that are leaking methane that are being used to generate electricity that have waste heat. They're building one of these at a place that already has landfill natural gas generation going on. And that's going to last, what, 50 years? I don't know how long a landfill lasts as a natural gas source, but it's a long time. And so that improves the efficiency of their situation and brings their costs down to the point where they think they can be cost effective. One of these is being built in the United Kingdom, as far as that goes. This might be the way it works. Minutes, hours, maybe days with batteries, and then we do some kind of fluid storage in a tank. Or maybe we just say, you know, we don't even need that. 90%, that's close enough, and live with it from that standpoint. I'm going to change gears here a little bit and talk about policy, because part of this is what happens with policy. Now, I believe, and I know many of you probably believe the same thing, that a monopoly electric utility shouldn't be allowed to have more than one single meter on my house, okay? A single revenue meter, that anything else above that is inappropriate because of cost. Remember, it's just a house or a small business, not very much electricity used. Unlike what you might do with an IBM that uses literally 20,000 times as much electricity as a house, where you might want to put multiple meters in or something like that. This is a house we're talking about. Single meter, stores hourly data, and is read once a month by a car driving by, because that's the cheapest way to do it. When you have to read a city's 40,000 meters, you can either do it by using real-time networks, which means you have to support the real-time network. How many people pay about $50 a month for internet access? Okay? You pay that much. Oh yeah, some of it's for content and that kind of stuff. Some of it's for profit. But a lot of it is actually to keep it running, because how many times have you had to call up Comcast because something's busted? That costs them money. How many times do they have to send out line people to come and work on the lines? That takes money. If you do this, a network with the meters, the way Xcel wants to do, that costs money. Doesn't make any sense at a home. The second reason we don't want real-time meters in homes is because Xcel knows an awful lot about you. In fact, the Public Utilities Commission did a study of what can happen with metering, and I'm coming to why this is included with storage in just a minute, okay? As some of you were wondering. The study from the Public Utilities Commission said not only can we tell when somebody's home or when somebody's on vacation from remote distance with a real-time meter, we can also tell what brand of refrigerator you have. Now, I submit to you that a government-regulated monopoly electric company does not need to know what kind of refrigerator I have. In fact, it's an intrusion on my freedom and privacy. Yes, sir. I told you I'm already taking lessons. That's lesson 1. I need lessons 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay?
You try to give away so much more on Facebook, etc.
Okay, so, but what is it that Xcel wants? Well, those of you that have solar systems probably have a second meter for PV production, which makes no sense. And for people that wanted to install energy storage, Xcel is insisting that people install a third meter. This is wrong. In fact, both of those meters is wrong. It's inappropriate in a residence. It's an invasion on our freedom and privacy. It's wrong. In fact, for the storage meter, they don't care if you're putting electricity back in or not. And in fact, it doesn't matter, because the revenue meter, a single revenue meter, can tell if you're putting electricity back in just as easily as any other one can. There was some reasonable argument, maybe. Actually, there never was a reasonable argument in a residential setting for having the solar production meter, but there is no rational argument for having an energy meter. And here's my basic question. Are we going to need an electric vehicle meter? Are we going to put an e-meter on my dog? Okay? It's not right. It's not appropriate. Senator Steve Fenberg from the city of Boulder, yeah, yay, has submitted a bill. It's in the legislature right now to say you can't put on a small residential or commercial business, you can't put a meter for this energy storage system. That's what the bill says. Xcel is fighting it tooth and nail. We need support, particularly in Wheat Ridge, Lakewood, and Brighton. If you're interested in working on that bill, if you know somebody in these areas and you think they might be willing to talk, have them connect with me. And finally, if you are interested in competition in electricity generation in Colorado, talk with me. Bill McKibben said, climate change is a war where winning slowly is exactly the same thing as losing. I'm not interested in losing that war. Thank you so much.
My goal here is actually to give you a bigger overview picture. My role in the energy industry is large-scale renewable projects, very, very big utility scale, not so much dealing on the residential. And battery storage is a very important piece of that. 2017, where we are right now, definitely different than where we were a year ago. Now, I've been giving technical presentations for almost 30 years now. One of the things that I look out and I see people falling asleep, I lose people, and so I'm trying to take a different approach today. So instead of telling you just about battery storage on the electric grid, where are we in 2017, and giving you all the details, I'm actually going to tell you a love story. Battery meets grid, falls in love. That's the story I'm going to tell you tonight. Battery storage has many attractive qualities for the grid. I thought the best way to tell you about those qualities was to make a Match.com profile for the battery. If the battery was going to give you a paragraph to talk about how attractive it is, it would say, I'm flexible and versatile with many skills and talents. I've been waiting for the right connection, but because I'm different, I'm often misunderstood. I can be like a generator or a load, and I can provide primary frequency response better than any other electric equipment on the grid. I'm dependable and reliable. I'm seeking a stable grid connection with a partner who can appreciate and acknowledge me both as a transmission asset and a generation asset. So we're going to talk about these highlights. The battery loves company, but it's also happy being alone. What does that mean? Well, the battery can work as a standalone generator, or, for example, one of the way batteries can pair with fossil fuels, or they can pair with renewable. Combine with renewables. Let me talk about the fossil fuels. So one of the things that we have on the grid today are peaking plants or spinning reserve plants. These are plants that aren't generating. They have to keep a minimal level of output going because when load ramps up, they have to respond quickly. And to do that, they need to be running at a minimum level. So they're not putting energy on the grid, but you know what they're doing? They're putting CO2, pollutants, all sorts of stuff in the atmosphere. The problem is that if they were to be turned off, it can take 30 minutes to start them up. That is too long. We could have a shortage, we could have blackouts, we could have to drop load. We can't do that. If you combine these units with a battery, you can turn it off. And then when they need to be called into action, they can take their time. They can start up. They can take the 30 minutes that they need. This is good for the grid, and this is good for the environment. The other combining, so for example, renewables, wind or solar. Solar is a really good pair with the battery because the battery can take in the power, kind of like Ken talked about the hydroelectric, you basically store the energy and then deliver it when it's needed. So I think that's the one that most people are aware of, that's an application. The helpful in emergency situations. I think we kind of hinted on that with the fossil fuel battery combination, that when that generation is needed, it's called upon. Also, for example, if the grid is losing its frequency, if something has dropped off, these batteries can come on. They can also act like a load, though. Sometimes load can drop really quick, and then it takes time to ramp down generation, so the battery can act like a load and absorb the power. Batteries are amazing. They're very versatile and helpful in emergency situations. Okay, so how come batteries in the grid didn't make this love connection sooner? Why didn't that happen? Well, the first thing is the grid thought batteries were out of its league, that they were too expensive, and to an extent, they were correct. However, today, the cost is very reasonable. I was just at the Minnesota Energy Storage Alliance Coalition just earlier this month, actually, and there was a presentation by one of the electric utilities, and the presentation was already out of date in that the cost had come down, and for utility scale, they were at 7 cents a kilowatt hour. That is what was listed on the presentation. Okay, the next problem, clueless on how to make the initial connection. So that's my job. I do interconnection and transmission for large-scale renewables and also high-voltage DC transmission lines. There is a real lack of policy. There are a lot of barriers to getting battery storage on right now. Some parts in the country have it right. California, also in the east, PJM interconnection, I'll show you a little bit about that in a later slide. But for the most part, there's a process that you have to go through to study electric generation before you can connect it to the transmission lines and send that power out to the cities. The whole process, the policy, the technical studies that need to be done, they're just not in place, and that connection piece has been difficult. So we're working on that. And then didn't know how they could communicate with each other. This is a big issue because the way batteries perform on the grid is different than other devices. Batteries are very, very fast responding. So one of the things that we see is some places in the country, one of the areas that I work a lot in the Midwest, the system operator there is the Mid-Continent System Operator, also known as MISO. They have pump storage type generation on their grid. But that gets a dispatch signal every hour. And so within the hour, they can, they can either save the energy or store the energy, deliver it. But when you get batteries, they can't work on an hourly cycle. They have charge cycles that are necessary for their chemical processes and to make them deployable, to be able to have them available under emergency situations. They don't work under that. They need a faster dispatch signal, and you have to build that into the algorithm that controls the grid. That's what the fast AGC. AGC is an acronym for automatic generation control, and that's important for how the grid is managed. So AGC is it's in a few places like PJM interconnection. It's in development in other places, but it's certainly not across the footprint. This is what I talked about earlier. This is how the country is segmented. So everywhere that you see a colored entity on the map, those are the system operators. They control the grid. So some folks may or may not be aware, the electric grid of the US is split into 3 entities. There is a Western interconnect, an Eastern interconnect, and then Texas right here is its own little island. And it's called ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. Why do you guys think that Texas is its own little island? Yankees. Yeah, something like that. So once... So you're very close. It's really within that same category. When you transact power through transmission lines across state lines, you come into federal jurisdiction. They did not want to be federally regulated. So as long as they kept their own separate grid, then they could be regulated within their state, which actually, to be honest, has been very good for renewables, because in a lot of these multi-state system operators, as you see, they're all except for CalISO in California, they have to consider many different utilities, many different state regulatory policies, and it's very difficult for them to move, and they have different moving parts, and people can't always agree. So if you have a system like ERCOT in Texas, and even CalISO, which is its own state, it's within that state, they're able to move quicker and implement policies. And actually, Texas has done a lot of good for renewable energy. It was really interesting because I was at a wind power, the National Wind Power Conference, a couple years back, maybe 2010, and the keynote speaker was George W. Bush. And it was because he had done a lot for wind energy in Texas. It's about money, and there's money in it. So the west here is, where you see the white area, that is something we are not within an ISO, we're not within the market. Ken talked about that, how we don't have this market environment. We're under a regulated utility, and that's a barrier to buying and selling and transacting renewable energy. There are some efforts to move towards that, but nothing that's congealed yet. Okay, so one of the things, right, these two, they're having a hard time getting together, so the federal government's going to step in and help create marriage policies for these two. One of the things that when I give people presentations to talk about connections to the electric grid, I say the first thing you need to know about interconnecting generation to the grid is a 4-letter word that starts with F. FERC. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. What did you think I was going to say? So one of the things, FERC, if you're not familiar with it, FERC is a 5-person commission that's appointed like the Supreme Court, directly from the president. And they oversee legal matters related to national energy issues. Disputes, they have a judicial function. However, unlike the Supreme Court, FERC actually has a legislative function. It can implement, it can make policy. So for example, they may be seeing a lot of cases coming in that they're dealing with the same problem, so they will initiate a rulemaking, legislation, and they do that through the NOPR, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. And that goes out, and they have a technical conference, they receive comments in, and then eventually they will issue an order. It was actually FERC that issued the order that deregulated our electric market, that set up those transmission operators. FERC has actually done a lot to help open up the possibility for renewable energy on the grid. And right now, as we speak, there is a NOPR out on battery storage. Comments are being collected in, and they are in process of rulemaking to try and standardize so that we can have interconnection policies that work. Also, another concern is cost recovery. Batteries, they can be a transmission asset, they can be a generation asset. How are the utilities, how are the independent power producers going to make their revenue back for those capital investments? Those are all issues that are being looked at right now at FERC. Plus, there is a case that has currently gone to FERC. It is one of these cases, why can't they just be together? There was a 20 megawatt project that was recently built in the Mid-Continent System Operator, and they have no means for cost recovery. Now, they took this case to FERC to get the rulemaking, which that actually helped bring on the NOPR, because the company that did this is AES, one of the largest battery developers in the world. And so they're trying to open that floodgate. That was why they built that project. They had the money to build a 20 megawatt project in hopes, right? It's an investment risk that once those policies get set, then they'll be able to build more of these projects. And that will set potentially a precedent for the rest of the country where we don't have good policies. So let's talk about, what does it take to make the marriage last between the battery and the grid? What's needed? The good connection, right? The interconnection policies that we talked about. No company is going to want to develop and invest millions of dollars in capital infrastructure if they're going to go through an interconnection process and they're going to be told, well, it's going to be too costly. You're going to need to do this or do that, or it's not going to be practical for them in some way. We need those policies, and we need them throughout the country. Maintain good communication. That fast automatic generation control signal. This is a different piece of equipment. It's different than everything else that's on the grid. It needs to be able to respond in the way that will utilize this resource, this asset, to its full potential, and also run it in a way that's not going to destroy its life and make its useful life less because they're giving it really inappropriate charging signals. Must accept that battery storage is a flexible partner. This is a really important piece because battery storage, as we know, it can act like a generator and it can supply power. You can charge it up and then you can deliver the power later to save cost, or when, say, the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. But it can also be used as what they call an ancillary service. That means it's not giving power, it's not a load, it's basically responding to keep the grid functioning and to support the grid operation so the grid doesn't go down. And then it can also be used as a load, which that's largely, it does work as a load. It will go back and forth when it's being used as an ancillary service, but it's not per se delivering, it's not getting paid for an energy delivery. It's getting paid for its ability to provide emergency services and grid support services. The last thing that battery storage can do is it can avoid costly transmission upgrades. So instead of building a $100 million new transmission line or a $60 million transformer, you can put a battery on. So it's a transmission asset. It can be a transmission asset, it can be a generation asset, or it can be used as an ancillary service. The hard part is, what combination and permutation of those three can you use, and how do you get your cost recovery? That's where the joint tax returns come in. We need to deal with the financial matters. All marriages have to deal with the financial piece. All right. Is this going to be a happily ever after? It seems like it will. This cost of battery storage is competitive. Like I said at this presentation, they showed 7 cents per kilowatt hour, and that it's even come down since then in some locations. That it has a wide variety of grid application, and needs to be acknowledged for what it is. Needs a partner that appreciates it for what it has to offer. And then the policies. The regional policies, the federal policies, those are very important. So, if you need to talk to me, I am the grid marriage counselor. I bring these two together. That's what my role is. My contact information is here. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, anything you think of after the meeting. And I'm going to leave you with a concluding thought about this love story. Unlike a marriage between people, when the battery has run out of its useful life, the grid can get rid of it free of charge. Thank you.